Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God, the Almighty. Because of His grace, because of the blood of His Son, we can enter into the presence of a holy God as we are now in our worship. We're glad that you can be present for it. It's a blessing to be able to be together on the Lord's day as the Lord's people to give Him the glory that's due His name. And it's good to I look out and I see a number of visitors who are with us and have been with us recently and are back again. That's encouraging. And maybe I've overlooked someone who's here for the first time. But whatever has brought you our way, please let us know if we can help you in understanding God's plan for your salvation and what He's revealed in His Word about His will for your life. There's nothing more important than the well-being of your soul to God, and it's important to us, and certainly we hope it's important to you, and so we want to encourage you to let us know if we can open God's Word together with you. I thought I'd just mention, I want to be careful how I say this. I appreciate all the men who lead us in worship, and I think they all do a wonderful job. And our men who speak at the table, when we take the bread and the cup, do a great job. But I just wanted to say, Ed, I really enjoy when you speak, when we take the supper. You know, Ed has this presence. He's a big, tall, handsome guy, and he's got that stately voice. And I don't know if you know this, but you're almost 90, right? Do I have that right, Ed? So I think one of the great injustices in all of life is that I lost my hair in my 40s, and Ed still has this luscious head of beautiful silver hair, and so you're blessed in that regard. But if God grants that I can have as many years as you have had, and hopefully you'll have many more with us, I hope that I can still that I can speak as well and think as well and present as well as you do. So we appreciate that, brother. But as I said, we appreciate all of our men who lead. And we know we're blessed to have men who are willing to do it and are capable of it. And truly we're blessed in so many ways to be a part of God's church here at League City. Joe is in what we often call the Holy Land right now. Joe Higginbotham is there with his family. He texted me a picture the other day. They were in front of the Jordan River, one of the places I think could be where John was baptizing, perhaps where Jesus was baptized by John. And so they're touring those historic places. And one of the places that people will be brought to see is called the Pool of Siloam. And for many years, what you're seeing here on the screen was thought to be the location of that Pool of Siloam at the end of Hezekiah's Tunnel. Those of you who've been there likely know what I'm referring to here. More recently, in 2004, I believe it was, they're still making discoveries there. There's still archaeological digs going on throughout Jerusalem and that area. They found what is now believed to be the actual site where the Pool of Siloam was. I know it's a little bit hard to see in here on the screen, but now visitors who want to see these sites that we read about in Scripture will be taken to this site as the place where this pool of water was in the city. Why? Why is that significant? Because of what took place there that we read about in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 9, where Jesus healed a man born blind, and he used the water at the Pool of Siloam in connection with his giving that man his sight. And many artists have depicted what that pool may have looked like at that time. I think it's interesting to see different representations of it. And of course, the miracle itself has inspired great artists through the ages. Some of these works are from the 17th century, hundreds of years old, that have tried to capture in some way the way the artist has imagined the scene and the disciples with Jesus and the question about the man. When I first thought this one, I thought it was Jesus actually blinding the man because it looks like he's thrusting his finger into his eye. But it is also a striking depiction of that scene. And then I usually, if you notice when I use this kind of artwork in presentations, I usually work my way to newer and less detailed images. And these are some from artists of our own time, and that one might take a second for you to see. But because Jesus made mud with his spit and dirt and anointed the man's eyes, you see this depiction of the thumbs putting that on the man's eyes. But this is the image I settled on. When I was looking for images, this one grabbed me. It really struck me as something extraordinary, something beautiful. If you could see the detail of the brushwork, it is, I think, truly an amazing work of art. And so I decided to take that and work it into the slides that I'm going to have before you now, because we're going to look at this case here in John chapter 9, and I'll have the text on the screen before you, but if you want to turn there in your Bible, certainly I'd encourage you to do that. And this is the title for the lesson I would tell you to write down here, Elijah: the light of the world and the eyes of the blind. If that were the title, that's what I would tell you to write down. But it's not. See, I wanted him to start writing it. I know there's a few note takers here. But I decided, that was too cumbersome. It's too long and wordy. I wanted something terse and a little catchier. So I've got, how's that? 3 words. None so blind. But that would be a good subtitle, that last one. None so blind. Write that down at the top of the page if you're taking notes. And you understand. You hear that and you know it's part of that proverbial saying that has endured. None so blind as he who will not see. Well, in the next lesson, you'll see why I'm calling these lessons that. Because yes, watch it, wait for it, here it is. Yes, it's part 1. We're doing a series on it. It was either try to cram it all into one really long marathon lesson and where you are, or try to do it, treat it better, and I think that I can justify what's in the text, or do justice, I should say, to it better if I have a little bit more time to go through the things that we see here. So next time you'll see why I've chosen that title for these 2 lessons, Lord willing. So none so blind. Now I've worked on how do I want to word these points. So I know people like to have major points to structure everything on. And I have preached before where I don't have them. I just talk and develop the subject and finish. But I know people prefer it if you break it down where you've got titles to your points. So I thought about this. Here's what we're going to have. First of all, an awkward assumption. And we'll see here that has to do with a question about suffering that comes up in the text. An awkward assumption, a purpose in our pain. See the alliteration? Is it working? There, God works in our hardships, we'll see. A muddy miracle, that should be obvious enough, but there's a lesson in obedience here that I think is quite instructive. And then a sign with significance. I know that's a little bit redundant, but again, trying to stay with the alliteration. Am I trying too hard there, Ben? Is it a little much? Well, Christ, the light of the world. We'll see that when we come back to that final point. So, first of all, there's this awkward assumption. And I say awkward because when Jesus and his disciples encounter this man born blind, the disciples just assume this man must have sinned, or his family, his parents. And to think that this is the kind of accusation a poor, blind beggar like this man would have to endure throughout his life. Here's what the text says here in John 9, verses 1 and 2. We read, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. So all of these years, to think that the man has not been able to see. And that's why I caught myself a minute ago. I said Jesus made mud when he restored his sight. But he's not restoring it. This man has never been able to see. So try to imagine what life would be like and how wondrous this miracle is going to be for him. So his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now notice they don't say, did someone sin that caused this man to be born blind, his parents or the man himself? They just assume in the question, I say an awkward assumption, awkward for this poor man to have to go through life, knowing that people thought he must have sinned. There was even a view if you were born with some congenital defect like this, some kind of handicap like this, if you were born that way, that you may have sinned even in your mother's womb and you were being punished for it, if you can figure that out. But that must have been your parents then perhaps sinned, or that God knew you would be the kind of person who was going to be a sinful person. So to think that this is the way other people were judging you because you were blind, so you're already suffering with this malady. And that may have even been the way the man thought about himself. Well, it must have been that I've done something wrong, and God, I'm not a good person, and God has punished me in some way for this. So it's unfortunate, but on the one hand, bear in mind that it is true that suffering, that disease, and these maladies that we have in the mind and body, that they are a result of the fall and the curse of sin. We have sinned. And because when sin came into the world, a curse came upon the world. We know we're living under conditions that allow for these kinds of sicknesses and these defects and these maladies. And so we endure disease and pain and suffering of different sorts, and we ultimately face death. So you can link our suffering ultimately to sin. The problem was, in Jesus' day and in the ancient world in general, this view persisted. And it's the idea that if we want to avoid charging God with causing evil in this world, so that it's God's fault the man is blind, they believe God was sovereign and that everything happened he must cause in some way. And so we don't want to condemn God, saying that God made the man blind, so it must be. See, they thought they were doing justice to God to say, so it must be that man sinned. And that was the view, that people's sin, their misfortune, terrible tragedies and accidents, the loss of loved ones and things of that nature, that if these things came upon you, that it was justice, that it was punishment from God because you sinned. Well, that is often true, that we sin and then we reap the consequences of it, and some suffering comes upon us. But what, of course, we need to understand is that a particular case of suffering, though, is not always a direct result of a sufferer's own sin. If I go out and live recklessly in the lust of the flesh and then develop some disease, some debilitating disease, and I'm having to endure that affliction, you could say, well, that I'm reaping what I have sown, and I'm suffering in this case because of my sin. But we can't point to every case of a person suffering and assume, of course, that would be an egregious error to assume that must be in this particular case because that person did something sinful and the person's being punished for it. But that was the assumption that man had to consider. But look at Job. That was the problem that Job faced. His friends, his suffering was so profound, his loss is so great, and his friends come to him. And what you're reading in the book of Job, in the cycle of speeches in the book of Job, is they're coming to him over and over and trying to get him to confess whatever his sin is. You must have sinned, Job. Why won't you confess? And they accuse him of being stubborn and blind and arrogant to his own sin. And Job keeps maintaining his righteousness. But that was the assumption they brought to Job. And you remember in Luke 13, Jesus brought up a couple of cases. See, I like to use current events and deal with what's going on in culture and all that. And Jesus brought up a couple of things like that. He talked about some who died in a tragedy, a tower fell, and some who suffered because of evil, who were murdered by Pilate. And he said, do you think they were worse sinners than everyone else because those things happened to them? That's the way people thought. And of course, Jesus' own suffering and his death is proof that righteous people can be mistreated and can suffer, not because they're suffering directly for any sin that they've committed. So we understand that. Now, why do I say this next point? There's a purpose in our pain, that we see here God can work in our hardships. Well, in a way, I suppose each one of these could be its own lesson. I'm just going to have to treat this lightly here and quickly, but Jesus, notice in his reply, he answered, it was not this man that sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. So he's saying here, this presents an opportunity for God to work. In this case, the way God is going to work is in healing the man. Now, that may not always be the way God works in our suffering, but when you look at what Jesus said here, I think we should be careful. Was Jesus meaning to say, well, look, the man didn't sin and his parents didn't sin, but God made him blind so that I could come along, and he suffered through this all of these years since the time that he was born, so that I could come along and heal him. I don't think that's necessarily what Jesus is saying here. And in fact, if we just make a slight adjustment in the punctuation, I think you can see that. So remember, the original text in the Greek manuscripts, we're reading English translations of what was originally written in Greek. And there was not punctuation. There wasn't capitalization of the first letter of the first word in a sentence, and you didn't have sentences broken up with punctuation like we have it today. That's a modern convention. And you know that a subtle change in punctuation can make a big difference. Look at this simple example here. You say, hey, let's eat, Grandma. But if you take out that comma, look at how dramatically the whole meaning changes, right? So, listen, punctuation, proper punctuation saves lives, people. That's what I'm trying to say. They almost ate Grandma, but the comma saved her life. So here, look, this was, here you see the English Bible and the ESV. So you've got a comma after the word parents and then a period, and then the sentence begins with, we must work the works of him. Now watch if I just change that and put a period there instead, so that sentence ends. And then the next sentence begins, where Jesus says, no, it was not this man that sinned or his parents. Period. See, without the period, you keep reading, it sounds like he's saying, the man is blind, not because he sinned or his parents sinned, but the man is blind so God, as though God blinded him so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So instead, this leaves it more as an open question. So there's a period, but that the works of God might be displayed in him, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. So you see there's a subtle difference there. And I think that the point is that Jesus doesn't really address the issue of exactly why he's blind. So he's not giving us an explanation for his suffering, and we don't always get an explanation for our own suffering, and we simply have to accept it and endure it and put our trust in the Lord. And Jesus here, I think, helps us to see that suffering, and watch carefully because this is just the first part of the sentence here. I'm going to complete it. But he helps us see suffering as an opportunity to glorify God. You might say, oh, because he's going to deliver me from it and show how great and wonderful he is. Well, in this case, that's true of the blind man, but there were many other people who lived and died blind in Jesus' time and from that time. But an opportunity to glorify God, whether he delivers us from our suffering or not. It may be God will glorify his name by granting me relief and release and healing, or he will glorify his name in my suffering. You see that with Jesus himself in John 12 as he's facing the cross. The shadow of the cross is looming near. And what does he say? Now is my soul troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I have come to this hour. So then what did he say? What was his prayer? Father, glorify your name. I mean, I'm here to pass through this suffering. And Jesus said, glorify your name, Lord. He viewed his suffering as a way that God was going to bring glory to his name. And if I respond in love and in faith and trust God through my suffering and remain faithful to him in my suffering, I can bring glory to God in that way. So that changes the way we look at every issue in our lives. We could say, well, why isn't God delivering me from this loneliness or this mental struggle or this family issue or this financial problem or this health issue that I have? Well, it may not be that deliverance is going to come when or in the way that we intended, or it may be deliverance will come ultimately when we leave this life and we're delivered from all the evil that we face in this world, all the suffering that we face in this world. And it may very well be that he has chosen instead to glorify his name in ways perhaps unknown to me through my suffering, by carrying me through and developing my own faith and the faith of others through it. Well, here with the miracle, and I'll need to pass kind of quickly through this, but I love this story because it's a great one to use to deal with objections that sometimes people make about baptism, right? And I think it's fairly obvious, but let's walk through that together. So what did Jesus do? And this is one of 3 miracles that Jesus used his spit. He healed 2 other blind men in the book of Mark using his saliva, but this is the only one where he spits in the dirt and makes mud from it. So he spit on the ground and he made mud with saliva. And it might be he does this, I can't say I know, but later the Pharisees claimed that this was doing work on the Sabbath, because in their tradition of what was allowed on the Sabbath, you couldn't knead dough. And so taking your spit, yes, isn't that, taking your spit and making mud out of it, they say, oh, he's working on the Sabbath. You know, he's a sinner. But, and so maybe Jesus was knowing that kind of response, provoking that, but that's what the next lesson is going to be about, is the conversation that comes as a result of this, the whole debate that follows it in the whole chapter. The miracle is just this short part at the beginning, and then you look at all the rest of the chapter centers around what happened as a result of it. So he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And so that pool is referred to as sent. Jesus sent him there, and the Hebrew consonants for the noun sent are also the same ones in the verb go, or to send. So he went, and he washed, and he came back seeing, right? That's not hard to understand. Jesus said, just do this. So he went and did it. I like later when they asked him, well, how did you receive your sight? But you notice, he says the same thing. He says, well, the man called Jesus, he made mud, he anointed my eyes. He said, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed. So I went and did it. And I received my sight. So he doesn't say, well, wait, Lord. I've heard you're the miracle worker. That with just a word from you, I can be made well. That you can just will me to see right here, right now. Why would I have to go all the way to the pool of Siloam and make my way and have somebody guide me through the city and go there and wash off this mud? Jesus, mud can't restore my sight. You need to restore my sight. Water in the pool of Siloam won't cause me to see, Lord. He doesn't question it. He doesn't object to it. He doesn't subject it to his own analysis as whether or not that would be a reasonable thing for God to require. See, people do all of that with baptism, unfortunately. But he does it, and God gives him his sight. Now, I love the way this has been depicted in some images I found, where there's the mud being anointed, and then a boy is depicted here. That part's just embellished, but we're trying to imagine how he got to the pool of Siloam and was brought to the water, and Jesus said, go wash it off, and that's what he did. And can you imagine when for the first time he opened his eyes and he could see? What that would be like? I recently saw, do you know what a reel is? You guys that use YouTube or the little short videos on Instagram, the social media, the little short videos now that everybody texts to each other and watches all the time. I saw one recently of a boy. Let me know later if you've seen this. It was a boy who was colorblind, and apparently there's a kind of colorblindness that they can fix with very expensive glasses. Have you ever heard of that, anyone? And so not everybody can have these glasses. So this boy was colorblind, and they had the room full of all different color balloons. He's this young boy, about 8 or 10 years old. And he opened his present he got for his birthday, and they were those glasses. And he put those glasses on, and he could see all the colors. And he started crying and hugged his parents and thanked them. And his brother was sitting on the couch. His brother started crying. It's a really touching scene. Just now to be able to see these colors. Imagine the whole world lighting up. And now you can see. And so he could see. But he just did what Jesus said to do. Now let me ask you. Sometimes people say, well, it doesn't make sense. You'd have to get baptized to be saved. It's not water that saves you, it's the blood of Jesus. Well, does spit make a person's sight come back? Does Jesus' saliva had some power in it? Or the mud? Or the water in the pool? Like Russ preached a while back, I think it was last year, he preached on Naaman. When Naaman was told to go dip 7 times in the Jordan and be cleansed, and he objected at first, and finally his servant said, look, why don't you just do what the prophet told you to do? And he went and dipped, and he came up out of the water after he dipped 7 times. He was cleansed. The water didn't take away his leprosy. God did. But his obedience was being tested. And so here, it wasn't the water, of course. What caused the man to see? The power of God. Who did it? Jesus restored his sight. Not the spit or the mud or the water. Obviously, we understand that. But when did it happen? That's the question. When and how did Jesus restore his sight? It came when he did what the Lord told him to do. And when he did that, and he went to the water, and he just did what the Lord said to do, that's when the Lord restored his sight. Now, one other question. When he did what the Lord required him to do, was he earning his... Sometimes people say, oh no, you can't get baptized to be saved. You people in the churches of Christ are all wrong. Because Paul said we're saved by grace through faith, not of works. There's no works involved in salvation. You can't be saved by your works. And so they assume getting baptized is like a work you do to earn your salvation. And nothing could be further from the truth. When that man went and washed, did he think he was getting a right, that he was earning on the basis of his own goodness and merit, Jesus to give him his sight? Of course not. He understood fully, no doubt. It was the mercy of the Lord that restored his sight. It was the power of the Lord. And he wasn't somehow justifying himself or earning his salvation just by going to the water like the Lord said. That's why Peter tells us God used water to save Noah and his family from a corrupt world. And he said, and that's like baptism. He says baptism now, that's a figure of, or it corresponds to what happens to you when you're baptized. Baptism now saves you, but he said not as a removal of dirt from the body. It's not because there's anything in the water that makes you clean. That's not it, of course. But it's your response. Like that man, you're responding from a good and honest heart. It's the appeal to God. You're appealing to God. You're appealing to God for what he has done. It's through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's through the work of Christ. Baptism is not trying to earn your salvation by your works. It's begging God to save you by the work of Jesus. It's because God said, this is the point at which the work of Jesus will be applied to you and you will be made whole. That shouldn't be difficult, right? But yet we know that it is, and maybe because many people have been led astray on the subject of how to be saved. I've been talking about that recently in several lessons. But maybe this case here of John with the blind man can help us teach people and help them understand that point. But finally now, this is where we'll close. You see this sign, there's a significance to this particular miracle. It shows us Christ is the one who brings light into the world. He calls himself the light of the world. In John John is unique. Unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John just selects 7 signs. And there's a heavy symbolism in the signs that John selects. And unlike in the Synoptic Gospels, in the other Gospels, you'll have frequent references to numerous miracles. John picks some and then elaborates on them. Then there's a whole story that centers around that miracle and what it signifies, like the feeding of the thousands in John 6. That gave Jesus a chance that was a miracle he performed, but it's only in John that Jesus then goes on to say, I am the bread of life. See, I'm the one who's come down from heaven to feed you. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, a miracle that's only in John, he used that occasion to say, I am the resurrection of the life. These I am statements in John's gospel. We should have a sermon series on them sometime. But here, this is one of those I am statements that's already been made in John. But here we go back to our text, and what does Jesus say? We must work the works of him who sent me while it's day. The night is coming when no one can work. But now, as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. And he continues to be the light of the world to those who receive him, to those who believe on him, to those who follow him. But then he said, I am the light. You see it? I am the light of the world. John 8 and verse 12, he already announced that in this same context. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but you'll have the light of life. Key concepts in John: light, life, abundant life, John 10 and verse 10. All of that from Christ. See, without Jesus, we're left wandering in the darkness. But with Christ, what do we sing in one of the most famous of all Christian hymns, in Amazing Grace? This metaphor is taken and applied to when we're saved. What do we sing? I was blind, but now I see. So I was lost, that's another metaphor. And I'm found, I was blind. You see, now I can see. Spiritually, we're blind. Our condition is wandering in darkness without purpose and without the direction that we need in our lives and without the life that comes from the light of life, Jesus Christ. But we have to be willing to turn from that darkness, as we'll see in the next lesson. We have to be willing to recognize our own blindness, our own need for Christ. We have to be willing to see for him to restore our sight, spiritually speaking. We have to come to the light. Will you do that? Let us know. Let's stand and sing this song together.